Hey everyone, it's Kenji. Today I'm going to be making my old boss Barbara Lynch's gnocchi recipe. So this is a potato gnocchi with roasted mushrooms and peas in a cream sauce. At the restaurant, this was one of my very first restaurant jobs, Number 9 Park. You know what, I'll start making it and then I'll talk. So what we got to do here, a few components to this dish. There's a cream sauce, which is basically reduced heavy cream with a little bit of garlic. I'm going to start with that. So I'm just going to get some heavy cream into a saucepan. We're not going to use all of this in the dish, but I'm going to reduce all of it so that I have it on hand for when I need it in the future. And then I'm going to take a couple of garlic cloves. Just pop them in there, lightly crushed and whole. Just like that. And then I'm going to bring this to a bare simmer. And we're going to let this reduce down. Okay, so I'll start it over sort of moderately high heat until it gets to a simmer. And then I will reduce that down to as low as it needs to go to maintain a very, very slight simmer. The second component of the dish is these roasted mushrooms. So this is a dish from Number 9 Park, which was a restaurant in Boston. It's still there. This was sort of one of their signature dishes. And this was one of my very first restaurant jobs. I started working there in in the year 2001, I believe. One of my very first restaurant jobs. I cooked on the pasta station and the garde-manger station. And so I made this dish, I don't know, dozens of times a day, probably thousands of times over the course of the 2 years that I worked there. Very, very popular dish. You could order it as is with just the mushrooms and peas in the cream sauce, gnocchi with mushrooms and peas in the cream sauce, or you could supplement and add lobster to it. So actually, one of the first things I remember, the sous chef there, a guy named Jason Bond, who went on to open his own restaurant called Bondir in Cambridge. He had a huge impact on my cooking career. I remember a day, one of my first days working there, when I was doing this, I was cutting mushrooms and I was very slowly kind of trimming off the bottom, and then I would hold it like this, and I would hold the mushroom like that, and then I would take this piece and I would trim it like that, and then I would take this piece and I would trim it like that. And he was watching me do this for a while with the mushrooms, and then he came over and he said to me, "Kenji, you got to work with a sense of urgency, because in a restaurant you do got to work with a sense of urgency. You always got to be thinking, how could I do this more efficiently?" Because, well, as a future restaurant owner, as a restaurant owner, I found out, that by far the biggest cost in a restaurant is payroll, and so you do want your workers to get as much done in as little time as possible, whether that's right or wrong. But anyhow, I was told to work with a sense of urgency, and that's why I started cutting my mushrooms like this, where I grab them, I trim off the end. Rather than laying them flat, I start by cutting them like this. I keep the two halves together, I roll it, and then I split them again. And so that's a much faster way to cut your mushrooms into quarters. But that has always stuck with me, the work with a sense of urgency. As a home cook now, I think more, only work as urgently as you need to work. But the more you get used to doing these things, the more second nature they become, and the easier it is to work quickly without really sort of breaking a sweat. So I work basically at a pace that I feel is leisurely, but I think because I have a lot of experience, it ends up looking kind of fast. All right, so this is just going to simmer down until it's reduced by about, we want it to reduce to about 2/3 of its original volume, maybe half its original volume. Meanwhile, I'm going to take these mushrooms, pop them in a bowl, and we're going to roast them. So like a lot of restaurant dishes, this dish is made up of several components that you can prepare separately and store separately, and then when someone orders the dish, you put it all together really quickly on the spot. The part that, we call that part the à la minute part. À la minute means like when it's ordered, at the time of service, at the minute of service. All right, so mushrooms, salt, some extra virgin olive oil. You'll notice I didn't wash the mushrooms. They didn't seem particularly dirty. If your mushrooms are very dirty, you can go ahead and wash them. It'll just make the roasting time a little bit faster, a little bit slower, but not much. There's nothing wrong with washing mushrooms. And then I'm going to toss them to sort of evenly coat them with that oil, salt and pepper. a sheet tray. Give it a little shake to distribute them. I'm going to put some thyme sprigs on top. Just kind of roughly spread them around on top. And these, really are just going to perfume them. We're going to pick them off after. A few of the leaves might sort of fall in there and stay, but for the most part, you're just kind of trying to perfume the mushrooms as they cook with the thyme, right? And so these are going to go straight into an oven. I'm using my toaster oven, 400 degrees, and we'll let them roast until basically they're nicely brown, but they're still sort of pliable. You don't want them to go until they're completely dry. You want them to be nice and pliable at the end. Meanwhile, I'll clean up and get my final components ready. I'm not going to be doing the lobster today. And in fact, I'm not going to be doing the most important part of the dish, the gnocchi, the potato gnocchi from scratch. I'm using store-bought potato gnocchi, which are just fine, and a big time saver. They're not as light and delicious as homemade gnocchi. But that said, even homemade gnocchi, if you haven't had a lot of experience doing it, they're probably going to end up sort of heavier tasting than the store-bought gnocchi anyway. So you might just, if flavor is your concern and convenience is your concern, you might be better off on both fronts just buying the gnocchi. Which is not to say that you shouldn't learn how to make gnocchi if you really want to. For a garnish, we're going to use some chives here. These are some relatively thick chives that we picked from the community garden next to my daughter's school. They're kind of overgrown. It's the winter right now, so the chives are a little overgrown. I remember there was a day when I was working at Number 9 Park, and the chef de cuisine, this guy Dave Bazargan, who also went on to have his own restaurant, a couple of restaurants in San Francisco. He now works at a restaurant as the chef de cuisine at a restaurant called Uni in Boston, which coincidentally was also a place I used to work as a sashimi chef. But Dave, I remember there was a day when we were making this gnocchi dish and the chives came in, the delivery of chives came in that morning, and there were these kind of big fat chives, that overgrown chives that look kind of like these. And at first he was a little bit annoyed because they didn't look exactly like the chives we normally get. And at a restaurant, consistency is pretty key. But then he chopped them up and he tasted them, and he decided that those big fat chives actually tasted better than the small dainty chives. Oops. Yep, that was a common occurrence. This happened all the time. Pots of milk and cream tend to overflow very easily, and they do it when you're not looking. So you either gotta constantly be watching them or just be okay with a little bit of an overflow. Give that a quick cleanup. What I don't want to do is let this stuff burn onto my clean stovetop, because then it never comes off. All right. So Dave, Baz, we called him. He tasted it and he declared that the big fat chives had more flavor than the small chives anyway, and that we were going to use them, and he was happy with them. And I distinctly remember him saying, it's all about the flavor over the appearance. And I really remember that lesson. So thanks, Dave. Anyhow, which is to say, I am totally fine with using whatever chives I happen to have on hand, whether they're big and fat or whether they are small and dainty. We've got basically all of the components done here since we're not doing the lobster. And the only other component is peas, which I'm using frozen peas. You can use fresh peas, of course, but I'm using frozen peas. Frozen peas are one of those things that in the freezer aisle that are generally very, very good. And it's because they're so small that they freeze very rapidly and thaw very rapidly, so you don't end up sort of bursting a lot of cells or sort of ruining the texture of them like you would with a lot of other vegetables. But frozen peas, generally very, very good to use. So I'm using frozen peas. Now all I'm going to do is wait for those mushrooms to finish roasting, wait for my cream sauce to finish reducing, and at that point I'll have everything basically ready to go, and I'll show you how this dish comes together. So I'll be back in 15 minutes or so. So the mushrooms have been in here about a total of a half hour. At one point, I just took them out and gave them a little toss because you can see the parts that were in contact with the aluminum, they tend to get a little browner. So I give them a little toss just so they brown a little more evenly. But those mushrooms, that's what we're sort of looking for here. We want them to be browned, but still juicy and kind of pliable. We don't want to let them go to a crisp. You can, of course, let them continue to cook until they're almost mushroom chips, and that's a delicious thing as well. But it's not exactly what I'm going for in this particular dish. All right, so I'm going to take these mushrooms. I'm going to put them on my cutting board first so that I can pick out the thyme stems a little more Meanwhile, I'm gonna turn off the oven and throw my serving plate in there. That's what I'm gonna serve my single serving of gnocchi in. I want it to be warm so that the sauce doesn't cool down as soon as it goes into the pan. Right. And so one of the key things with cooking in a restaurant that you can actually take home as well is that you cook components. So I'm going to have these mushrooms. I'm going to store them on their own. I'm not going to store this as a finished dish. I'm going to store it as its individual parts because that gives you more flexibility. It lets you cook a smaller portion at a time, for instance. It also lets you use these for other things. So these I can put in this dish. I could also let them cool and put them in a salad and they'll be delicious. Or, you know, put them into a beef stew, or throw them in my next chicken soup. There's my pasta water going. All right, so same thing with my reduced cream mixture. I'm just gonna fish out those garlic cloves. They've given up their flavor at this point. You can eat them if you want. If you want to eat those softened garlic cloves, go for it. But I'm going to put this into a container also. So what I'm doing right now actually is this dish, I'm going to serve it to my family for dinner tonight. But right now I'm going to make a single portion for myself just to show you how this idea of cooking with parts will work. I like to label things, so I will pull off this piece of tape. That way, if I change my mind and I don't end up serving this tonight, I just throw it in the fridge. I'll know exactly what it is. I'll know exactly when I made it. So to finish off this dish, I'm going to start by cooking a portion of gnocchi, like a single serving of gnocchi. It'll be like, for me, maybe, let's say about that much. Okay. Frozen peas. I'm going to cook those right in that same pan of boiling water as the gnocchi. And then over on the side, I'm going to get my cream sauce in there. Get some of my mushrooms in a skillet. That sauce is not yet seasoned, so I will add some salt to it there. Peas will go in for like the last 30 seconds or so of cooking. With gnocchi, essentially once they start floating, they're basically done. Taste this, make sure that it's seasoned properly. Yep, that's great. Got my warm bowl out. All right, so our gnocchi are floating, which means they're ready to go into here. Straight into our sauce. I'm going to put a sprinkle of chives in there. Give it a toss. If you don't want to toss like that, you can also, just use a spoon. That works fine. Give it a toss like that. But you can see how nice and how the cream is basically coating the gnocchi at this point. It's really nice and saucy. It's not runny. It's not loose. It's creamy, the way a good sauce should be. And now, if I were to add lobster to this dish, I would have had my lobster already poached ahead of time, chopped up into bits, into little bite-sized pieces, and then I would add it right at the end because I don't want to overcook the lobster. All right, we're done. Oh, by the way, if your sauce starts to sort of over-reduce, like it gets a little too sort of runny, or if it even breaks, for example, if the fat starts to come out of the cream, all you have to do is take a little bit of the pasta water, a spoonful of it, add it in there, and stir it around, and that will re-emulsify it. Basically, you need the ratio of fat to water to be within a certain range for the emulsion to be stable. Okay, and we're just gonna put this into our warm bowl. Not to be confused with Warm Bow of Some More News. Yum, yum, yum. Finish it off with some more chives. And that is our dish. Let me go hold it up to the camera. Show you how this looks here, huh? I don't know. Does that look good? I bet it does. Looks good to me. It's so easy, especially sort of when you have those components on hand. So those things, I could throw those parts into the fridge and make this dish 2 days later, and it'll take me 5 minutes start to finish. You know, as soon as the water boils, throw the pasta and frozen peas in, heat up the mushrooms and the cream in a skillet on the side, and put it all together. And it would be the same whether I'm making 1 portion or 5 portions. All right. Guys and gals. And non-binary. Oh, hamon. Hamon. Come on. Come here. Want a piece of gnocchi? All right. Good boy. Guys and gals and dogs and non-binary pals, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.